My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 34 years old. Most people who know me only know one version of my life. A single mother of two, working as a bank teller at First Union Bank, counting every dollar carefully to make sure rent gets paid and my children have what they need. What most people do not know is that I have another life entirely, one I have kept hidden for almost 4 years. My husband, Daniel, was a software engineer who built a small company from nothing in our garage, back when we were newly married and barely scraping by ourselves. Over 8 years, that small company grew into something much bigger, a data security business that eventually caught the attention of a large technology corporation. 2 years before he died, Daniel sold the company for an amount of money I still sometimes struggle to fully believe, even now. We had just started adjusting to our new financial reality, still living modestly out of habit, still driving our old cars, still shopping at the same grocery store, when Daniel died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 36 years old. He left behind 2 children, a wife who barely understood half of the financial accounts he had carefully organized, and more money than either of us ever expected to have in our entire lives. After the funeral, after the shock slowly settled into something more like constant, quiet grief, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew about our situation, including the small handful of financial advisors managing Daniel's estate. I decided to keep working, not out of necessity, but out of desperate need for normalcy, for routine, for something that felt real and grounded during a time when everything else in my life had been turned completely upside down. I did not want my children growing up surrounded only by wealth and privilege, disconnected from the value of hard work that Daniel and I had built our entire relationship around. I did not want people treating me differently once they learned about the inheritance, watching every word I said, wondering what I wanted from them, seeing dollar signs instead of a grieving widow trying to raise 2 children the best way she knew how. So I kept my fortune quiet, managed carefully through a private trust under my maiden name, Sarah Reyes Holdings, completely separate from my everyday identity as Sarah Mitchell, single mother and bank teller. Only my closest financial advisor, a careful, discreet woman named Diane Whitmore, and my elderly parents knew the true scope of what Daniel had left behind. I took a job at First Union Bank about 6 months after Daniel's death, partly because I genuinely enjoyed working with numbers and helping ordinary customers with their everyday financial needs, and partly because it felt important to maintain some connection to the working, striving life I had always known before wealth complicated everything. My children, Lily and Ben, ages 7 and 5, had no idea their mother possessed a fortune worth $63 million, carefully invested and growing steadily under Diane's watchful management. To them, I was simply Mom, the woman who packed their lunches, worked long hours at the bank, and tucked them into bed each night with quiet, exhausted love. I told myself this arrangement worked well for everyone. I got to raise my children with genuine values, unburdened by the complicated dynamics that sudden extreme wealth often brings. I got to maintain real friendships and real routines, unclouded by people's assumptions or expectations about money. Some mornings, driving to the branch in my modest, aging sedan, rather than anything flashier my accounts could easily have afforded, I thought about how strange my double life might look to an outsider. I packed lunches in the same reused containers I had used for years. I clipped coupons at the grocery store, not because I needed to save the money, but because the small, ordinary ritual of it kept me grounded, kept me connected to the woman I had always been before Daniel's success changed everything about our family's circumstances. My coworkers knew me as careful, patient, always willing to stay a few extra minutes helping an elderly customer who needed extra time understanding a new account feature. They had no reason to imagine anything different lay beneath that ordinary, hard-working exterior, and honestly, most days, I nearly forgot it myself. So completely had I settled into the rhythms of my chosen, deliberately modest life. I had no idea, walking into work that particular Tuesday morning 4 years after Daniel's death, that a disagreement over $17 would soon force my 2 carefully separated lives to collide in ways I never could have imagined. The First Union Bank branch, where I worked, sat on a busy downtown corner, serving a steady stream of regular customers throughout each day, from elderly retirees depositing pension checks to young business owners managing daily cash transactions. I had worked there for almost 3.5 years by that point, gradually earning a reputation among both customers and coworkers as reliable, patient, and unusually good with difficult or confused clients who needed extra help navigating banking procedures. My branch manager, a man named Grant Pierce, had been running that particular location for about 18 months, transferred in from a smaller branch across town after some corporate restructuring. Grant was ambitious, focused intensely on hitting performance metrics and maintaining strict, by-the-book procedures throughout his branch. He was not unkind exactly, but he treated every interaction as a transaction to be measured and evaluated, rarely showing warmth toward employees or customers alike. I had always sensed something slightly dismissive in how Grant treated me specifically, though I had never quite pinpointed the source of that feeling. Perhaps it was simply his general management style. Perhaps it was something more personal. Either way, I had learned to keep our professional interactions brief and focused entirely on work. That Tuesday morning began like any other. I arrived 15 minutes before my shift, as I always did, organizing my teller station carefully before customers began arriving. My coworker, a friendly young man named Marcus, who worked the station beside mine, greeted me with his usual cheerful energy. "Morning, Sarah." "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing toward the small break room where he had just finished making a fresh pot. "Please," I said gratefully, accepting the warm cup he offered. Ben had a rough night. Bad dream about monsters under his bed. I think I got maybe 4 hours of sleep total. "Rough," Marcus said sympathetically. "My sister's kids go through phases like that too. It usually passes eventually." We chatted easily for a few minutes before customers began arriving, the familiar rhythm of our workday settling comfortably into place. I processed deposits, handled withdrawals, helped an elderly customer named Mr. Abernathy set up automatic bill payments for his utility accounts, patiently explaining the process twice more than usual, since he seemed particularly confused that morning. Around midday, during a brief lull between customers, Grant walked past my station, glancing briefly at my computer screen and transaction log with his usual clipped efficiency. "Sarah, make sure you're documenting every large cash transaction properly today," he said, his tone carrying its typical business-like coolness. "Corporate is doing a compliance review this week, and I don't want any discrepancies traced back to this branch." "Of course," I said, nodding professionally. "I always document carefully." Grant gave a small, non-committal nod before moving on toward the next teller station, offering similar brief instructions to Marcus and our other coworkers. I had no idea, going about my ordinary Tuesday duties with the same careful, professional attention I always brought to my work, that within just a few hours, a simple counting error involving $17 would set into motion the most dramatic afternoon of my entire professional life. The trouble started around 3 o'clock that afternoon, during the routine cash drawer count that all tellers performed before closing out their station at the end of each shift. I counted through my drawer carefully, as I always did, tallying the total cash against the transaction log recorded throughout the day. When I finished my first count, the numbers did not match. My drawer was short by $17. This kind of small discrepancy happened occasionally in banking, more often than most customers probably realized. A customer might receive an extra bill by mistake during a busy transaction. A counting error might occur during a particularly hectic rush. Bank policy required documenting any discrepancy immediately and recounting carefully to identify the source of the error. I recounted my drawer twice more, carefully checking each transaction against my log, trying to identify exactly where the $17 discrepancy had occurred. After nearly 20 minutes of careful review, I still could not pinpoint the exact source of the error, though I suspected it likely happened during a particularly rushed transaction with a customer named Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly woman who had grown flustered and confused while withdrawing cash for her granddaughter's birthday gift. I remembered the transaction clearly. Mrs. Kowalski had come to my window mid-morning, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to explain exactly how much cash she needed, changing her mind twice about the amount, apologizing repeatedly for holding up the growing line behind her. I had counted out her bills carefully, or so I believed at the time, reassuring her gently that there was no need to rush. In hindsight, somewhere during that patient, careful exchange, $17 had likely slipped free from proper accounting. An easy, understandable mistake given the circumstances, but a mistake nonetheless. Following standard procedure, I documented the discrepancy carefully in my end-of-day report and flagged it for review, exactly as bank policy required. This kind of minor discrepancy, I knew from experience, typically resulted in a simple conversation with a supervisor, a brief note in my file, and a reminder to double-check careful counting procedures during busy periods. It was not, under normal circumstances, a serious disciplinary matter. I submitted my report and prepared to close out my station for the day, glancing at the clock and thinking about picking up Lily and Ben from their after-school program before their pickup deadline. Grant appeared at my station just as I finished organizing my final paperwork, his expression unusually stern even for his typically businesslike demeanor. "Sarah, I need to speak with you in my office," he said, his voice carrying a sharpness I had not heard from him before. "Of course," I said, slightly puzzled by his tone, though not yet particularly worried. Minor cash discrepancies happened occasionally, and I had never once been disciplined for one during my entire 3.5 years at the branch. I followed Grant toward his small corner office, glancing briefly at Marcus, who offered me a slightly concerned look from his own station, clearly sensing something felt different about this particular interaction. I had no idea, walking calmly toward Grant's office that afternoon, that within the next 15 minutes, my quiet, carefully maintained professional life was about to unravel in front of my entire branch. Grant's office was small but neatly organized, a single window overlooking the busy street below, his desk covered with carefully arranged folders, and a computer monitor displaying various compliance reports. He gestured for me to sit down across from his desk, his expression remaining tight and serious. "Sarah, I've reviewed your end-of-day discrepancy report," he began, his tone clipped and formal. "A $17 shortage in your cash drawer." "Yes," I said, nodding calmly. I recounted 3 times but couldn't pinpoint the exact source. "I suspect it happened during my transaction with Mrs. Kowalski this morning." She seemed quite flustered, and the withdrawal amount was somewhat complicated. "That's not really the point," Grant said, his fingers tapping impatiently against his desk. "This is the 3rd discrepancy flagged at this branch in the past 2 months, and corporate is already scrutinizing our compliance record ahead of this week's review." Confusion flickered through me. "I've never had a discrepancy before, Grant. This is actually my very first one in over 3 years working here." "I'm aware," Grant said, though his tone suggested he did not find this fact particularly reassuring. "But given the timing, with corporate compliance reviewers arriving this week, I need to demonstrate that this branch takes cash handling extremely seriously. Unfortunately, that means I need to take disciplinary action." My stomach tightened with growing unease. "What kind of disciplinary action are you considering?" Grant hesitated for just a moment, though his expression remained resolute. "I've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The words landed like a physical blow. "You're firing me? Over $17? "It's not just about the $17, Grant said, though his explanation felt thin and unconvincing even as he spoke it. "It's about demonstrating strict accountability standards ahead of this compliance review. I need to show corporate that we take these matters seriously, without exception. Grant, this is a completely normal, minor discrepancy," I said, my voice rising slightly with disbelief. "Bank policy doesn't call for termination over a first-time $17 shortage. You know that as well as I do." "This isn't following proper procedure at all. I'm the branch manager," Grant said, his tone growing colder and more defensive. "I have discretion in these matters, and I've made my decision." I sat there for a long moment, stunned, trying to process what was actually happening. 3.5 years of reliable, careful work, completely dismissed over a minor discrepancy that fell well within normal, expected banking errors. "This feels incredibly unfair," I said quietly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I have 2 children depending on this income, Grant. This isn't just some abstract policy decision for me." Something flickered briefly across Grant's expression, something that might have been discomfort, though it disappeared quickly beneath his rigid professional mask. I understand this is difficult, but my decision stands. Please collect your personal belongings from your station. I'll need you to leave the premises within the next 30 minutes. I stood up slowly, my whole body feeling strangely numb with shock and disbelief. As I walked back toward my station to gather my things, I noticed several coworkers watching quietly, clearly having overheard at least portions of the tense conversation through Grant's thin office walls. I had no idea, gathering my few personal belongings from my teller station that afternoon, humiliated and shaken in front of coworkers who had become genuine friends over the years, that I was about to make a decision that would completely upend not just my own carefully hidden secret, but Grant Pierce's entire career as well. I gathered my few personal belongings from my station in silence, my hands trembling slightly as I placed a small framed photograph of Lily and Ben into my purse, along with a coffee mug Ben had painted for me at a school art fair the previous year. Marcus approached quietly as I finished packing, his expression full of genuine concern. "Sarah, what happened? Grant just fired you? Over the discrepancy from this morning?" "Apparently so," I said, my voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Over $17, Marcus. 3.5 years, and he fires me over $17 during a rushed morning transaction." "That's completely insane," Marcus said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's not even close to normal procedure. I've had discrepancies before, way bigger than that, and nothing ever happened beyond a quick conversation and a note in my file." "I know," I said quietly. "I don't fully understand it either." Other coworkers offered quiet, sympathetic glances as I made my way toward the front doors, several people pausing their own work briefly to express quiet words of support and disbelief at what had just happened. The genuine kindness from my coworkers, even amid my humiliation, offered small comfort during an otherwise devastating afternoon. Grant remained in his office throughout my departure, not once stepping out to offer any further explanation or acknowledgement, his avoidance somehow making the whole situation feel even colder and more dismissive. I walked out onto the busy downtown street, the afternoon sun feeling strangely bright and cheerful against the devastating weight settling into my chest. I stood there for a long moment, simply trying to process everything that had just happened, before remembering that I needed to pick up Lily and Ben from their after-school program within the next 20 minutes. I drove to their school in a daze, my mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Losing this particular job did not threaten my family's financial security, not with the fortune Daniel had left carefully invested and growing under Diane's management. But the humiliation, the unfairness of the situation, the casual dismissal of 3.5 years of reliable work, cut far deeper than any financial concern possibly could. I picked up my children from their after-school program, forcing a calm, cheerful expression as they excitedly told me about their day, Ben proudly showing off a drawing he had made during art time, Lily chattering happily about a new friend she had made during recess. "Mommy, are you okay?" Lily asked suddenly, pausing in her excited chatter, her perceptive 7-year-old eyes studying my face carefully. "You look kind of sad." "I'm okay, sweetheart," I said gently, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just a long day at work. Nothing for you to worry about." We drove home together, and I managed to maintain my composed, cheerful facade throughout dinner, homework help, and bedtime routines, not wanting my children to sense the turmoil churning beneath my carefully controlled exterior. Once both children were finally asleep, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, staring at my phone for a long moment before finally dialing Diane's number, my trusted financial advisor who had carefully managed Daniel's estate and my own carefully hidden fortune for the past 4 years. "Sarah," Diane answered warmly on the second ring. "It's late. Is everything all right?" "Diane," I said, my voice finally breaking slightly with the emotion I had been carefully suppressing throughout the entire evening. "I need to talk to you about something. I think it's time to make some changes to my accounts at First Union Bank." Diane had been Daniel's financial advisor even before his company sold. A steady, careful presence who had guided us through complicated decisions neither of us fully understood in those early, overwhelming months following the acquisition. After Daniel's death, she had become something closer to family, patiently walking me through estate paperwork, investment strategy, and the countless small decisions required to responsibly manage a fortune neither of us had ever expected to inherit. Diane listened carefully as I explained everything that had happened that afternoon, my voice growing steadier as I worked through the details, the humiliation slowly transforming into something more like quiet, determined resolve. "Sarah, I'm so sorry this happened to you," Diane said gently, once I finished explaining the situation. "That sounds completely unjust, especially given your work history there." "It was humiliating," I admitted, honestly. Being fired in front of coworkers I've worked alongside for years, over something so minor, something that happens regularly in banking. It felt like Grant barely even saw me as a real person, just a convenient scapegoat for whatever pressure he was feeling from corporate. "What would you like to do?" Diane asked carefully, her tone professional but warm. I had been thinking about this question during the entire drive home from picking up my children. "I want to withdraw my funds from First Union Bank," I said firmly. "All of it. I don't want my money supporting an institution that treats hardworking employees this carelessly." Diane was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Sarah, I want to make sure you understand the full scope of what you're suggesting. Your primary trust account, along with your various investment holdings currently managed through First Union's private wealth division, totals just over $63 million. Moving that entire amount is not a small undertaking, logistically or otherwise." "I understand," I said, my resolve remaining steady, despite the enormous number Diane had just stated aloud. "I've been thinking about consolidating with a different institution for a while now anyway. Honestly, this just feels like the right moment to finally make that change." "There's something else you should consider," Diane said carefully. "A withdrawal of this size will not go unnoticed by the bank, Sarah. It will trigger significant internal review, likely reaching well beyond your local branch, probably all the way up to regional and even corporate leadership. Your name, and quite possibly your full financial story, could become known throughout that institution, and depending on how they handle the situation, potentially more publicly as well." 4. For 4 years, I had guarded my financial privacy fiercely, protecting my children from the complications that extreme wealth might bring into their otherwise normal, grounded lives. This decision risked unraveling that careful privacy entirely. "I've thought about that," I said slowly. "But Diane, I keep thinking about how Grant treated me today, and honestly, about how he probably treats other employees too, people who don't have $63 million quietly sitting in a private trust to fall back on. People who actually need that $17 shortage explanation to matter, who can't just walk away and find another job easily. I think there's something important about not staying silent here, even if it means my privacy becomes more complicated." "That's a very thoughtful way to look at it," Diane said, her voice carrying genuine respect. "Are you certain you want to proceed with the full withdrawal?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Let's move forward with it. First thing tomorrow morning." "All right," Diane said. "I'll prepare all the necessary documentation tonight. Given the size of this transaction, I would recommend we handle it in person, directly with First Union's private banking division downtown, rather than through standard channels. That will ensure everything moves smoothly and gets properly documented." "That sounds right," I agreed. "I'll meet you there tomorrow morning." After hanging up with Diane, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen for a long while, staring out the window at the dark, empty street outside. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring consequences far beyond what Grant Pierce could possibly anticipate, consequences that would ripple far beyond our small branch, and quite possibly reveal a version of myself that very few people in my current life had ever known existed. I had no idea, sitting there in the quiet darkness of my kitchen that evening, just how dramatically the following day would unfold, or how completely it would change the course of Grant Pierce's career, and my own quiet, carefully hidden life. The next morning, I dropped Lily and Ben off at school, forcing my usual cheerful, reassuring smile, despite the nervous anticipation building steadily in my chest. I drove downtown to First Union Bank's main corporate headquarters, an imposing glass building entirely separate from the small branch where I had worked for the past 3.5 years. Diane met me in the elegant lobby, dressed sharply in a tailored gray suit, carrying a leather folder containing all the necessary paperwork. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying my face carefully. "I think so," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it. We were escorted upstairs to the private wealth management division, a quiet, elegant floor, entirely different from the busy, ordinary banking floor where I had worked as a teller. A private banking representative named Mr. Alan Foster greeted us warmly, clearly recognizing Diane from previous interactions managing my accounts. "Ms. Whitmore, always a pleasure," he said, shaking Diane's hand before turning to me with a polite, professional smile. "And you must be Mrs. Reyes. Diane mentioned you wished to discuss some changes to your accounts today." I had almost forgotten that my private accounts were held under my maiden name, Sarah Reyes, completely separate from my everyday identity as Sarah Mitchell. The realization struck me with sudden, sharp clarity. Nobody at this private banking division had any idea that Sarah Reyes and the recently fired bank teller from their downtown branch, Sarah Mitchell, were actually the exact same person. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the strange, surreal feeling of the moment. "I would like to discuss withdrawing my full holdings from First Union Bank." Mr. Foster's professional smile faltered slightly with surprise. "The full amount? That's a significant decision, Mrs. Reyes. May I ask what has prompted this change?" "We would certainly want the opportunity to address any concerns you might have before proceeding with something so substantial." I considered how much to share, weighing my careful privacy against my growing determination to be honest about what had prompted this decision. "Actually," I said slowly, "I would like to explain something first. My name is not just Sarah Reyes. I also go by Sarah Mitchell, and until yesterday afternoon, I worked as a teller at your downtown branch location on 5th Street. Mr. Foster's expression shifted rapidly from polite professionalism to genuine startled confusion. "I'm sorry, could you clarify that? You worked as a teller at one of our branches?" "For 3.5 years, I confirmed. Yesterday, my branch manager, Grant Pierce, fired me after a cash drawer discrepancy of $17. My very first discrepancy in over 3 years of reliable work. He terminated my employment immediately in what I believe was a completely unwarranted, disproportionate response, seemingly motivated by pressure from an upcoming corporate compliance review." Mr. Foster sat back in his chair, clearly struggling to process this unexpected revelation. "I see," he said slowly. "And this experience has prompted your decision to withdraw your holdings?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I built a life very intentionally, Mr. Foster, keeping my personal wealth separate from my everyday work as a bank teller, because I wanted my children to grow up understanding the genuine value of hard work, rather than simply inheriting privilege without context. Yesterday, I experienced firsthand exactly how carelessly your institution can treat hardworking employees over minor, easily explainable errors. I don't wish to continue supporting an institution that operates that way, regardless of how generously they might treat me personally as a private wealth client." Diane, sitting quietly beside me throughout this explanation, offered a small, supportive nod, clearly having anticipated I might choose to share this fuller context during our meeting. Mr. Foster remained quiet for a long moment, visibly processing the full weight of what I had just explained. "Mrs. Reyes, or Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize. I want to make sure I fully understand the situation before we proceed. Are you certain you wish to move forward with the complete withdrawal, given everything you've just shared?" "I am certain," I said, my voice carrying quiet, unwavering resolve. "Please begin processing the necessary paperwork." Mr. Foster excused himself briefly, explaining that a withdrawal of this magnitude required additional authorization from senior leadership within the private banking division, standard procedure for any transaction exceeding certain significant thresholds. While we waited, Diane leaned over quietly. "You handled that beautifully, Sarah. I know sharing your full story wasn't easy, especially after working so hard to keep your identities separate." "It felt important," I said honestly. "I kept thinking about Marcus and my other coworkers at the branch, people who genuinely need those jobs, who don't have the luxury of walking away easily if something unfair happens to them. If sharing my story helps shine a light on how Grant treats employees, maybe it's worth the complications to my privacy." Mr. Foster returned about 15 minutes later, accompanied by a sharply dressed woman he introduced as Regional Director Patricia Yang, who oversaw private banking operations across several branches throughout the metropolitan area. "Mrs. Mitchell," Patricia said, extending her hand with an expression that carried genuine concern rather than simple professional courtesy. Alan has briefed me on the situation. I want to personally apologize for how you were treated at our Fifth Street branch yesterday. That is absolutely not reflective of the standards we expect from our management team. I appreciate that, I said carefully, though my resolve to proceed with the withdrawal remained unchanged. But I've made my decision, and I would like to move forward with transferring my holdings elsewhere. Patricia nodded slowly, clearly understanding that no apology alone would reverse my decision at this point. I completely understand, and we will process your withdrawal exactly as you've requested. However, I do want to ask, would you be willing to allow us the opportunity to investigate this situation fully? Not to convince you to stay, necessarily, but because what happened at that branch clearly requires serious internal review, regardless of your decision regarding your own accounts." Unquote. I considered her request carefully. I would be willing to cooperate with a legitimate investigation, I said finally. I have no interest in seeing Marcus or my other former coworkers unfairly treated either, if there's a pattern of poor management happening at that branch. Thank you, Patricia said, genuine relief evident in her expression. I will personally oversee that investigation, starting immediately. Diane and I spent the following 2 hours carefully working through the necessary paperwork, transferring my extensive holdings, various investment accounts, trust documents, and cash reserves into a newly established account at a competing financial institution Diane had already identified as a strong, reputable alternative. The sheer scope of the transaction, $63 million in total holdings, required extensive documentation and multiple layers of verification, occupying most of that entire morning. Throughout the process, Mr. Foster and Patricia remained professionally courteous, though I could sense their growing awareness of just how significant this loss represented, both financially and reputationally, for First Union Bank. By early afternoon, the transfer had been fully processed. My $63 million, carefully built through Daniel's original company sale and years of patient, thoughtful investment growth, now belonged to an entirely different financial institution. It's done, Diane confirmed, reviewing the final documentation carefully. Congratulations, Sarah. Your accounts are now fully transferred. I felt a strange, complicated mixture of emotions settle over me: relief, satisfaction, and something like quiet, unexpected empowerment. For the first time in 4 years, I had allowed my two separate identities, careful working mother and quietly wealthy widow, to fully intersect, and rather than feeling exposed or vulnerable, I felt surprisingly, powerfully whole. I had no idea, walking out of that private banking office that afternoon, just how quickly news of this dramatic withdrawal would spread through First Union Bank's corporate leadership, or how completely it would upend Grant Pierce's entire career within the following 24 hours. Word of the massive withdrawal reached First Union Bank's regional leadership within hours, triggering exactly the kind of internal alarm that any $63 million account closure would naturally cause at a mid-sized regional bank. Patricia Yang, true to her word, launched a thorough investigation into the Fifth Street branch immediately, requesting detailed records of recent personnel decisions, compliance procedures, and employee treatment patterns under Grant Pierce's management. Grant, unaware of the connection between his fired teller and the sudden, catastrophic withdrawal shaking corporate leadership, first learned something was seriously wrong when he received an urgent call from his direct supervisor, District Manager Robert Klein, late that same Wednesday afternoon. "Grant, I need you in a meeting first thing tomorrow morning," Robert said, his voice tight with barely concealed tension. "Corporate compliance and the regional director are both involved. This is serious." "What's this regarding?" Grant asked, genuine confusion evident in his voice, still entirely unaware of the connection to Sarah's firing the previous day. "I'll explain everything tomorrow," Robert said curtly. "Just be prepared to answer detailed questions about your recent personnel decisions, particularly regarding termination procedures." Grant hung up the phone that evening with a growing sense of unease, though he still could not connect the dots between his abrupt firing of a seemingly ordinary bank teller and whatever serious corporate matter now demanded urgent attention from regional leadership. He spent that evening quietly reviewing his own recent decisions, searching his memory for anything else that might explain such an unusually urgent, high-level meeting request, never once landing on the actual, improbable truth waiting to be revealed the following morning. He told his wife that night that he suspected the meeting probably concerned routine branch performance numbers, perhaps disappointing quarterly figures, or an unfavorable comparison against other regional locations. Nothing in his experience as a branch manager had prepared him to imagine that firing an ordinary teller over an ordinary cash discrepancy could possibly trigger a crisis significant enough to summon both a district manager and a regional director to the same urgent meeting. Meanwhile, back at the 5th Street branch, word had already begun spreading among staff members about my dramatic departure, though details remained fuzzy and incomplete. Marcus, curious and concerned about my sudden firing, had reached out to me that evening through a text message. "Hey Sarah, just checking in. How are you holding up? Everyone here is still talking about what happened yesterday. Grant's been acting really strange today too, lots of phone calls, looking stressed." I considered how to respond, uncertain how much information I should share before the bank's internal investigation had properly run its course. Finally, I typed back a careful, measured response. "I'm doing okay. Thank you for checking in. Some significant things are happening behind the scenes that I can't fully explain yet, but I promise everything will make more sense soon. Please know I have no ill will toward you or my other former coworkers. You've always treated me with genuine kindness." Marcus responded with obvious curiosity, though he respected my request for patience, simply sending back supportive words and well wishes. The following morning, Grant arrived at First Union's regional headquarters for his urgent meeting, still uncertain exactly what serious matter awaited him. He was escorted into a large conference room where District Manager Robert Klein, Regional Director Patricia Yang, and a senior compliance officer named Ms. Reina Castillo already sat waiting, their expressions uniformly serious and unwelcoming. "Grant, please sit down," Patricia said, her tone carrying none of her usual professional warmth. "We need to discuss the termination of Sarah Mitchell from your branch 2 days ago." Grant's confusion deepened further. "The teller with the cash discrepancy. I followed appropriate disciplinary procedure, given the upcoming compliance review pressures." "Did you?" Ms. Castillo asked sharply, opening a folder in front of her. "Because our records show Sarah Mitchell had an unblemished employment record spanning 3.5 years, with this being her very first documented cash discrepancy. Standard company policy for a first-time minor discrepancy under $50 calls for a documented conversation and additional training, not immediate termination." Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I felt termination was necessary given the timing of the corporate compliance review this week. I wanted to demonstrate strict accountability standards. "By violating our own established disciplinary procedures?" Patricia asked pointedly. "Grant, are you aware that Sarah Mitchell also happens to be a private wealth client of this institution, holding accounts under the name Sarah Reyes?" Grant's face went pale with sudden dawning confusion. No, I had no idea. I don't understand the connection." "The connection," Patricia said firmly, "is that yesterday morning, following her unjustified termination from your branch, Sarah Mitchell, known to our private banking division as Sarah Reyes, withdrew her entire holdings from First Union Bank. $63 million, Grant, transferred to a competing institution, directly as a result of how you treated her." The room fell into stunned silence as the full weight of this revelation settled over Grant, his face draining completely of color. $63 million, Grant repeated slowly, as though the number itself refused to fully register within his stunned mind. That's not possible. She worked as a teller. She wore the same simple clothes every day. She talked about struggling with childcare costs. "She is a widow raising 2 children alone," Ms. Castillo said, her tone carrying sharp, pointed disapproval. "Her husband built a successful technology company before passing away 4 years ago, leaving her a substantial inheritance that she chose, quite deliberately, to keep private from her everyday work life. She wanted her children raised with genuine values, unclouded by extreme wealth. That choice, Grant, is not a crime, nor does it excuse how carelessly you treated her as an employee." Grant sat frozen, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of his mistake. "I had no way of knowing any of this," he finally said, though his voice carried more panic than genuine defense. "That's precisely the point," Robert Klein said firmly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "You shouldn't need to know a person's net worth to treat them fairly and follow proper procedure, Grant." Sarah Mitchell deserved fair treatment regardless of whether she possessed $17 or $63 million. Your decision to terminate her employment, in clear violation of established company policy, would have been equally wrong even if she had no significant wealth at all. The weight of this statement seemed to land heavily on Grant, his earlier defensive posture slowly crumbling into something more like genuine, dawning shame. "What happens now?" Grant finally asked quietly. Patricia exchanged a brief glance with Ms. Castillo before answering. "Given the clear violation of company policy, combined with the significant financial and reputational damage this decision has caused our institution, we have no choice but to terminate your employment as branch manager, effective immediately." Grant's shoulders slumped, the full reality of his own dramatic downfall finally settling in completely. "I understand," he said quietly, all his earlier defensiveness now replaced entirely by resigned acceptance. "Additionally," Ms. Castillo continued, "our investigation has revealed this was not an isolated incident. We've received several other complaints from staff at your branch over the past 18 months regarding disproportionate disciplinary actions and generally dismissive treatment of employees. This pattern, combined with yesterday's events, leaves us no choice but to conduct a broader review of your management practices." Grant left that meeting a completely different man than the one who had confidently fired me over a $17 discrepancy just 2 days earlier, his career at First Union Bank effectively over, his professional reputation significantly damaged by a decision he could never have anticipated would carry such enormous, unexpected consequences. Word of Grant's termination reached the Fifth Street branch by that same afternoon, spreading quickly among staff members who had witnessed my own abrupt firing just 2 days earlier. Marcus texted me again that evening, his message carrying obvious shock and disbelief. "Sarah, I don't know what's going on, but Grant just got fired too. Corporate showed up, cleared out his office, everything. People are saying it has something to do with your firing. Is this true?" I smiled slightly, reading his message, finally feeling ready to share more of the full story with the coworkers who had shown me genuine kindness throughout my time at that branch. "Yes, it's true," I typed back. "I'll explain everything soon. I promise. There's a lot more to my story than anyone at the branch ever realized, including me sometimes." 3 days after the whirlwind of Grant's termination and the massive withdrawal that had triggered it, Patricia Yang called me directly, requesting a meeting to discuss the situation further. "I completely understand if you have no interest in continuing any relationship with First Union Bank," she said carefully during our phone call. "But I would deeply value the opportunity to speak with you personally, both to apologize properly and to discuss some changes we're considering implementing as a result of this situation." I agreed to meet her, curious despite myself about what changes she had in mind. We met at a quiet coffee shop near my home, away from the corporate offices and away from the Fifth Street branch entirely, a neutral space that felt more personal than professional. "Sarah," Patricia said, once we had settled at a small table with our coffees, "I want to start by saying how genuinely sorry I am for what happened to you. Not just the termination itself, though that was clearly unjust, but the broader pattern of dismissive treatment you experienced throughout your employment, treatment that our investigation revealed extended well beyond just that single incident." "Thank you for saying that," I said honestly. "I appreciate the investigation being taken seriously. I want to share what we've discovered," Patricia continued. "Grant's termination was necessary, but our investigation revealed something more troubling. Several other employees at that branch reported similar experiences, feeling dismissed, undervalued, treated as expendable rather than as genuine contributors to the branch's success. We're implementing significant changes to our management training and disciplinary review processes as a direct result." I listened carefully, genuinely encouraged by the scope of changes Patricia described: new mandatory review processes for any termination decision, additional training for branch managers regarding fair treatment and proper procedure, and an anonymous feedback system allowing employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. I also wanted to personally extend an offer, Patricia said, studying me carefully. We would be honored to have you return to First Union Bank, not simply as a teller, but in whatever capacity would genuinely interest you. Given everything you've shared about your background, your business acumen clearly extends well beyond ordinary teller work. We could discuss a management position, perhaps even a role helping shape these very policy reforms we're implementing. I considered her offer carefully, genuinely touched by the sincerity behind it, though I already sensed my answer even before fully articulating it to myself. I appreciate that offer, Patricia, truly, but I don't think returning to First Union Bank is the right path for me, at least not in a traditional employment capacity. Patricia nodded, though clear disappointment flickered across her expression. I understand. May I ask what you're considering instead? Actually, I said slowly, an idea that had been quietly forming over the past several days, finally beginning to take clearer shape. I've been thinking about something different. I have the resources now to build something meaningful, something that could actually help people in situations similar to what I experienced, working families who don't have $63 million to fall back on when unfair treatment happens. What did you have in mind? Patricia asked, genuine curiosity replacing her earlier disappointment. I'm not entirely certain yet, I admitted honestly, but I keep thinking about my coworkers at the branch. People like Marcus, hardworking, genuinely dedicated employees who don't have my particular safety net. I think I want to build something that supports people like them directly, maybe some kind of foundation or advocacy organization focused on fair workplace treatment, particularly for working parents balancing career demands with family responsibilities. Patricia's expression shifted into something like genuine admiration. That sounds like it could make a real difference, Sarah. If there's ever any way First Union Bank could support that kind of initiative, please know the door remains open. We finished our coffee together, the conversation gradually shifting into more comfortable, personal territory. Patricia asking genuine questions about Daniel, about Lily and Ben, about the careful balance I had worked so hard to maintain between my two previously separate lives. For what it's worth, Patricia said, as we prepared to part ways, I think the way you've chosen to raise your children, keeping them grounded despite significant wealth, shows remarkable wisdom. I hope you find exactly the right path forward with whatever you decide to build next. The following week, I invited Marcus to meet me for coffee, finally ready to share the fuller story behind my dramatic firing and its unexpected aftermath. He arrived looking equal parts curious and concerned, settling into the seat across from me with obvious anticipation. Okay, I have to know, he said immediately, barely waiting for our drinks to arrive. What actually happened? The whole branch is still talking about it. Grant getting fired, corporate showing up out of nowhere, rumors about some massive account withdrawal. Please, just tell me everything. I laughed softly, appreciating his genuine, uncomplicated curiosity, so different from the careful, calculated reactions I had received from various First Union executives over the previous week. Marcus, there's something about me you don't know, I began. Something I've kept private for the past 4 years. Actually, since before I even started working at the branch. I explained everything carefully. Daniel's company, his sudden death, the substantial inheritance I had chosen to keep separate from my everyday working life, and finally, my decision to withdraw my full holdings from First Union Bank following Grant's unjust termination decision. Marcus listened with wide, increasingly astonished eyes throughout my entire explanation, his coffee growing cold and forgotten on the table between us. Sarah, he finally said, once I finished, you're telling me you're worth $63 million, and you've been quietly working as a bank teller this entire time? I know it sounds strange, I said, slightly embarrassed by how dramatic the full story sounded when spoken aloud. I just wanted my children to grow up with genuine values, understanding real work and real effort, rather than simply inheriting privilege without any context or understanding. That's actually incredible, Marcus said, shaking his head slowly in amazement. I mean, I always thought you were one of the most genuine, hardworking people at that branch. Turns out you didn't even need the job, and you still worked harder and treated customers better than almost anyone else there. The work always felt meaningful to me, regardless of my financial situation, I said honestly. I genuinely enjoyed helping customers navigate their banking needs. That part was never about the money. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, still visibly processing the enormity of what I had shared. So what happens now? Are you going back to banking somewhere else? Actually, I said, I've been thinking about something different. I want to build a foundation, something focused on supporting working parents and fair workplace treatment, particularly for people who don't have significant financial safety nets to fall back on if something unfair happens to them professionally. That sounds amazing, Marcus said, genuine enthusiasm lighting up his expression. Honestly, Sarah, that branch could use exactly that kind of advocacy. Grant wasn't the only manager who treated employees carelessly over the years. I've seen it happen to other people too, just never quite this dramatically. An idea began forming as Marcus spoke, something that had been quietly circling at the edges of my thoughts over the past several days, finally crystallizing into clearer focus. Marcus, would you be interested in helping me build this foundation? I could really use someone who understands the banking industry firsthand, someone who genuinely cares about fair treatment for working employees. Marcus's eyes widened with surprised excitement. Are you serious? Sarah, I would love that, truly. Then let's figure out the details together, I said, smiling warmly at my former coworker, now potential business partner in this new, meaningful venture I had begun envisioning. I think we could build something that actually makes a real difference for people like us. As plans for the foundation slowly began taking shape over the following weeks, I realized it was finally time to have an honest conversation with Lily and Ben about our family's true financial situation. They were still young, 7 and 5 years old, but I wanted them to understand at least the basic truth about their father's company and the resources it had left behind, particularly since building this new foundation would inevitably become a visible part of our family's life going forward. I sat them down together one quiet Saturday afternoon, choosing simple, gentle words appropriate for their young ages. I want to tell you both something important about Daddy, I began carefully. Do you remember how I've told you Daddy built computer programs that helped keep people's information safe? Both children nodded, their expressions curious and attentive. Well, Daddy's company became very successful before he passed away, I continued gently. That means our family actually has more money saved than most families do. I've kept that part quiet because I wanted you both to grow up understanding that hard work and kindness matter more than having lots of money. But I think you're old enough now to start understanding a little more about our family's full story. Lily, ever perceptive even at 7 years old, considered this information carefully. Is that why you got fired from your job? Because of the money stuff? I smiled softly, appreciating her thoughtful question. Sort of, sweetheart. Someone at my job treated me unfairly, and I decided to make some changes because of it. But I want you to know, I never worked at the bank because we needed the money for our family. I worked there because I genuinely enjoyed helping people, and because I wanted us to have a normal, everyday kind of life together. Are we going to be different now? Ben asked, his young voice carrying a hint of worry. Like, do we have to move to a big fancy house or something? No, sweetheart, I said reassuringly, pulling him close. We're going to keep living exactly the way we always have. Same house, same school, same everyday routines. I just wanted you both to understand a little more about our family, especially since I'm going to be starting a new project soon, something that will help other families who are treated unfairly at their jobs, kind of like how someone treated Mommy unfairly. Both children seemed to absorb this information with the straightforward, practical acceptance that young children often bring to complicated adult matters, more concerned about whether their daily routines would remain stable than about the larger financial implications I had just described. Can we help with your new project? Lily asked eagerly. I want to help people too. Absolutely, I said, smiling warmly at her earnest enthusiasm. I would love that very much. That conversation, though initially nerve-wracking to navigate, ultimately brought a new sense of openness and honesty into our small family, one that I found genuinely relieving after 4 years of carefully maintaining separate, compartmentalized versions of our life together. Over the following months, Marcus and I worked steadily together, building what eventually became known as the Daniel Mitchell Foundation for Working Families, named in honor of my late husband, whose hard work and careful financial planning had ultimately made this entire venture possible. The Foundation's mission focused specifically on supporting working parents facing unfair workplace treatment, offering free legal consultation resources, financial assistance during periods of unjust termination disputes, and advocacy work pushing for stronger workplace protections, particularly benefiting single parents and low-income workers. Choosing the Foundation's name took several long conversations between Marcus, Diane, and myself. I initially resisted attaching Daniel's name so publicly, worried it might feel like I was using his memory for personal recognition rather than genuine service. But Diane gently reminded me that Daniel had always believed success meant nothing unless it eventually helped lift others alongside you. He built his company hiring people who needed a genuine chance. Remember, Diane said during one particular late evening planning session, people other companies overlooked because they lacked traditional credentials or polished resumes. I think he would be honored to see his name attached to something continuing that same spirit. Her words settled the matter for me completely, and from that point forward, the Daniel Mitchell Foundation for Working Families carried his memory forward exactly as I believed he would have wanted, quietly, purposefully, and always centered on genuinely helping people who needed it most. Diane, my longtime financial advisor, agreed to help manage the Foundation's financial operations, ensuring our resources were invested wisely and distributed efficiently to those who genuinely needed support. "I'm proud of what you're building here, Sarah," Diane told me during one of our regular planning meetings. "This feels like exactly the kind of meaningful work Daniel would have wanted his hard-earned success to eventually support." Marcus, meanwhile, proved himself invaluable in understanding the practical, everyday challenges facing working employees within the banking industry specifically, helping shape our Foundation's early advocacy efforts around fair disciplinary procedures and proper workplace protections. "You know," Marcus told me one afternoon, several months into building the Foundation together, "I never imagined my career path would lead somewhere like this. But honestly, this feels more meaningful than anything I did during my years working as a teller." Word of the Foundation slowly began spreading throughout the local community, particularly after a local news outlet picked up the remarkable story behind its founding: a single mother, quietly wealthy widow, fired from her ordinary teller job over a minor discrepancy, who then used her resources to build something meaningful for other working families facing similar unfair treatment. The story, once it became public, generated significant attention, far more than I had initially anticipated, when Diane first warned me that a withdrawal of this size would likely become known throughout First Union Bank's leadership. Reporters reached out requesting interviews, curious about both the dramatic circumstances of my firing and the inspiring foundation that had grown from that painful experience. I agreed to a small handful of thoughtful, carefully chosen interviews, always emphasizing the Foundation's mission rather than dwelling excessively on my own financial circumstances or Grant Pierce's professional downfall. "I don't want this story to become about revenge or dramatic wealth reveals," I told one particularly persistent reporter during an interview. "I want it to become about fair treatment for working people, regardless of their financial circumstances. Nobody should be treated as disposable, whether they're worth $17 or $63 million. That particular quote ended up widely shared, resonating deeply with countless working parents who recognized their own experiences of feeling dismissed or undervalued within their own workplaces. Grant Pierce, meanwhile, struggled significantly to find new employment within the banking industry following his dramatic termination, his professional reputation having suffered substantial damage from the widely circulated story. I heard, through occasional updates from Marcus and other former coworkers, that Grant eventually left banking entirely, taking a position in an entirely different industry where his previous professional history carried less immediate baggage. I felt no particular satisfaction in learning about Grant's continued professional struggles, though I also felt no genuine sympathy either. His decision to fire me so carelessly, without proper investigation or adherence to established company policy, had ultimately created consequences entirely of his own making. I had no idea, watching our small foundation grow steadily over those following months, just how significantly it would eventually expand, touching the lives of countless working families, far beyond what I had ever initially envisioned during those first uncertain weeks following my dramatic firing. About 8 months after founding the Daniel Mitchell Foundation, our small organization had grown considerably, now employing a modest staff of 6 people working out of a comfortable office space downtown, helping dozens of working families navigate unfair workplace disputes each month. One afternoon, while reviewing incoming case requests with Marcus, a familiar name caught my attention among the applications for assistance. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly customer whose flustered, confused withdrawal transaction had likely caused the original $17 discrepancy that started this entire chain of events, had submitted a request for foundation assistance regarding an unrelated matter involving her own workplace, where she worked part-time as a school cafeteria aide. "Marcus, look at this," I said, showing him the application. "Do you remember Mrs. Kowalski from the branch?" Marcus's eyes widened with recognition. The sweet older woman who always got a little confused with her transactions? Of course I remember her. "What's her situation?" According to her application, Mrs. Kowalski had recently been threatened with termination from her cafeteria position after a new supervisor claimed she had been working too slowly, despite her 12 years of reliable service at the elementary school. She needed her modest income to help support her granddaughter, whose parents had both lost their jobs during a recent local factory closure. "We need to help her," I said immediately, feeling a strange, almost poetic sense of connection to this particular case, given how her original confused transaction had unknowingly set my entire dramatic journey into motion. We assigned one of our foundation's legal advocates to Mrs. Kowalski's case immediately, ultimately helping negotiate a fair resolution that allowed her to keep her position with appropriate accommodations, recognizing her years of dedicated service, along with additional training support to help her adapt more comfortably to updated cafeteria procedures. When Mrs. Kowalski learned the full story behind the foundation helping her case, tears filled her eyes during a follow-up meeting at our office. "I had no idea," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "that my little mistake at the bank that day somehow led to all of this. I've felt terrible for years, wondering if I caused trouble for that kind, patient young teller who always helped me so carefully." "You didn't cause any trouble, Mrs. Kowalski," I reassured her gently. "You were never the problem. The problem was a system that treated a normal, everyday mistake as an excuse for unfair, disproportionate punishment. I'm just glad we could help you navigate your own unfair situation." This particular case, more than almost any other during our foundation's early months, reinforced my growing understanding of exactly why this work mattered so deeply. Ordinary people, hardworking and well-intentioned, often found themselves vulnerable to unfair treatment simply because they lacked the resources or knowledge to advocate effectively for themselves. Our foundation existed precisely to fill that gap, offering genuine support and advocacy for people who needed it most. Almost exactly 1 year after that fateful Tuesday, when Grant Pierce fired me over a $17 cash discrepancy, the Daniel Mitchell Foundation had grown into a genuinely significant organization, having helped well over 300 working families navigate unfair workplace disputes, secured meaningful policy changes at several regional financial institutions, and established ongoing partnerships with legal aid organizations throughout our metropolitan area. First Union Bank itself, following Patricia Yang's promised internal reforms, had implemented significant changes across their entire branch network, including mandatory review processes for any employee termination, additional manager training focused on fair treatment and proper procedure, and a confidential feedback system allowing employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Patricia reached out occasionally throughout that year, updating me on the bank's continued progress, and, on more than one occasion, referring specific cases directly to our foundation when she encountered situations that seemed to warrant additional advocacy support beyond what the bank alone could offer. I know this isn't exactly how either of us imagined our professional paths intersecting, Patricia told me during one particular lunch meeting, nearly a year after our very first conversation following Grant's termination. But I'm genuinely grateful for how this entire situation ultimately unfolded. First Union Bank is a fundamentally better, fairer institution because of everything that happened. I'm glad something meaningful grew from such a difficult experience, I said honestly. I certainly never imagined, sitting in Grant's office that Tuesday afternoon, that losing my job would eventually lead to building something like this. Marcus, now serving as the foundation's full-time operations director, had grown remarkably skilled at managing our organization's daily activities, coordinating case assignments, and building relationships with various community partner organizations throughout the city. He had, somewhat to his own surprise, discovered a genuine talent for public speaking as well, regularly representing the foundation at community events and local business gatherings, sharing our mission with a warmth and sincerity that consistently won over new supporters and donors. I never thought of myself as someone who could stand up in front of a room and talk about workplace fairness, he admitted to me once, after delivering a particularly well-received presentation to a local Chamber of Commerce meeting. But I guess losing that steady teller paycheck pushed me to discover parts of myself I never knew existed either. Sometimes I think about how different things might have turned out, Marcus reflected one afternoon, as we reviewed the Foundation's impressive first-year impact report together. If Grant had just handled that discrepancy the normal way, with a simple conversation and a note in your file, none of this would exist. All those families we've helped, none of it would have happened. It's strange to think about, I agreed thoughtfully, but I try not to dwell too much on those alternate possibilities. What matters now is the genuine difference we're making for people who need real support. Lily and Ben, now 8 and 6 years old, had grown increasingly involved in small, age-appropriate ways with our foundation's mission, occasionally helping organize donated school supplies for families we assisted, or drawing thank you cards for families whose cases had reached successful resolutions. I like helping people, Lily told me one evening, carefully coloring a thank you card for a family whose case Marcus had recently helped resolve. Is this what Daddy would have wanted us to do with his money? Her innocent, thoughtful question struck me deeply. I think so, sweetheart, I said gently, pulling her into a warm hug. I think Daddy would be incredibly proud of what we're building together. Nearly 18 months after my dramatic firing, I received an unexpected phone call from a name I had not heard mentioned in quite some time. Grant Pierce, calling from an unfamiliar number, asked politely if I might be willing to speak with him briefly. Curious, despite the complicated history between us, I agreed to a short conversation. Sarah, Grant began, his voice carrying a humility completely absent from our previous interactions. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, given everything that happened, but I wanted to personally apologize, properly this time, for how I treated you that day. I listened quietly, genuinely surprised by this unexpected outreach. I appreciate you saying that, Grant. Losing my position at First Union, and honestly struggling significantly to find new work within the banking industry afterward, forced me to really examine my own behavior and management style, Grant continued, his voice heavy with genuine reflection. I realize now how carelessly I treated employees throughout my management career, not just you, but many others as well. I was so focused on hitting performance metrics and protecting my own position that I lost sight of treating people with basic dignity and fairness. That sounds like meaningful reflection, I said honestly, genuinely encouraged by the sincerity in his voice. I actually wanted to ask, Grant continued, sounding somewhat nervous now, whether your foundation might consider a partnership opportunity. I've been working with a small nonprofit focused on management training and workplace fairness education, and I think there could be real value in combining perspectives, mine as someone who genuinely failed at fair management, and yours as someone who experienced that unfair treatment firsthand. The proposal surprised me, though after considering it carefully, I recognized genuine potential value in Grant's unusual perspective. I would be willing to discuss that possibility, I said finally. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to explore what that partnership might look like. Grant's voice carried obvious relief and gratitude. Thank you, Sarah. Truly, I know I don't necessarily deserve this opportunity, but but I promised to approach it with complete sincerity and accountability. That unexpected conversation eventually led to a modest but meaningful partnership between our foundation and Grant's management training organization, incorporating his genuine, hard-won understanding of managerial failure into broader educational programs aimed at helping other managers avoid similar mistakes. It was not the outcome I ever could have anticipated during those painful, humiliating minutes sitting across from Grant's desk, watching my 3.5 years of reliable work dismissed so carelessly. But it felt like a fitting, meaningful resolution nonetheless, transforming even that difficult, painful chapter into something ultimately constructive and educational for others facing similar workplace challenges. As the foundation continued expanding throughout its second year, I found myself increasingly drawn into the deeper, more strategic aspects of nonprofit leadership, learning alongside Marcus and Diane how to build something sustainable, something that could genuinely outlast the initial burst of attention and sympathy that had first brought us public recognition. Diane, ever practical and detail-oriented, helped establish a formal board of directors for the foundation, bringing in additional expertise beyond our original small team. Among the new board members was a thoughtful, soft-spoken labor attorney named Michael Torres, who had spent nearly 15 years representing low-wage workers in unfair termination disputes throughout the state. "Your foundation fills a gap I've watched grow for years," Michael told me during our first formal board meeting. "Legal representation alone often isn't enough. People need practical support too, help navigating unemployment paperwork, temporary financial assistance, guidance finding new employment quickly. What you've built addresses the whole picture, not just the legal piece." Michael's insights proved invaluable as we refined our foundation's services, eventually developing a more comprehensive support model that paired legal advocacy with practical financial assistance and career counseling services, ensuring families we helped receive support addressing every dimension of the crisis an unfair termination could create. Over those months working closely together, Michael and I developed a comfortable, easy friendship, one that gradually began carrying a quieter warmth neither of us initially acknowledged directly. He was patient with my children when they visited the office, unfailingly kind to our clients regardless of how complicated or emotionally difficult their situations became, and genuinely passionate about the same mission that had brought our small foundation into existence in the first place. "You know," Diane mentioned to me one afternoon, with the knowing, gentle smile of someone who had watched my life closely for the past 5 years, "Michael seems to light up whenever you walk into a room." I laughed, slightly embarrassed by her observation, though I could not entirely deny noticing something similar myself. "Diane, I'm not sure I'm ready for anything like that. It's been 4 years since Daniel, but sometimes it still feels complicated, thinking about building something new." "There's no rush," Diane said gently, "but don't close yourself off to happiness either, Sarah. Daniel would want that for you, I think. Building something meaningful doesn't mean closing every other door in your life." Her words stayed with me over the following weeks, gently challenging the careful, protective walls I had built not just around my finances, but around my heart as well, since Daniel's sudden, devastating loss. Slowly, cautiously, Michael and I began spending time together outside our formal foundation work, quiet dinners after long days, weekend visits to the park with Lily and Ben, who took an immediate, enthusiastic liking to Michael's patient, genuine warmth. "He's nice," Ben told me one evening, after Michael had spent the afternoon patiently teaching him how to properly throw a baseball. "Can he come over again soon?" "We'll see, sweetheart," I said, smiling softly at my son's earnest enthusiasm, allowing myself, for the first time in years, to genuinely imagine a future that included room for new happiness, alongside the profound grief and gratitude that Daniel's memory would always carry within our family. As our second year of operation drew to a close, the Foundation's board decided to host a formal fundraising gala, both to celebrate our accomplishments and to help expand our resources for the growing number of families requesting assistance each month. The evening brought together an unexpected mixture of people whose lives had intersected through this remarkable journey: Marcus and his wife, Diane and her husband, Patricia Yang, representing First Union Bank's continued partnership, Mrs. Kowalski proudly wearing a new dress she had purchased with her first paycheck after successfully keeping her cafeteria position, and even Grant Pierce, quietly attending alongside representatives from his management training organization. I stood at the podium that evening, looking out over the crowded room filled with people whose lives had been touched, in ways large and small, by the winding, unexpected path that had begun with a $17 cash discrepancy nearly 2 years earlier. 2 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet, attentive room. I was fired from my job as a bank teller over a minor cash discrepancy. I want to be honest with all of you tonight. That moment was humiliating, painful, and deeply unfair. I never could have imagined, sitting in that small office feeling completely dismissed and undervalued, that it would eventually lead to this room, filled with so many people who have helped build something genuinely meaningful together. I glanced toward Lily and Ben, sitting proudly at a nearby table alongside Michael, who had become an increasingly steady, comforting presence in all our lives over recent months. My husband, Daniel, built something remarkable during his short life, not just a successful company, but a foundation of values that taught me the genuine importance of hard work, integrity, and treating people fairly, regardless of their circumstances. I like to think this foundation, built in his memory, carries that same spirit forward into the world. End quote. I described briefly some of the specific families our organization had helped throughout the previous 2 years, careful to protect their privacy, while still conveying the genuine, meaningful impact of our collective work. I spoke about Mrs. Kowalski, about dozens of other working parents who had faced unfair termination or workplace mistreatment, and about the policy changes we had helped inspire across several regional financial institutions. None of this would have been possible without an incredible team of dedicated people, I continued, gesturing toward Marcus, Diane, Michael, and our small but committed staff. And honestly, without a certain branch manager whose poor decision, however painful at the time, ultimately set this entire journey into motion. A ripple of gentle, knowing laughter moved through the room, several eyes turning briefly toward Grant, who offered a small, humble, genuinely rueful smile in response. Tonight, I want to thank everyone who has supported this mission, whether through your time, your resources, or simply your belief that working families deserve fair, dignified treatment, regardless of their financial circumstances. Together, we've built something I believe genuinely honors both my husband's memory and the fundamental idea that everyone, whether they're worth $17 or $63 million, deserves to be treated with basic human respect and fairness. The room erupted into warm, sustained applause, and as I stepped down from the podium, Michael reached for my hand, his warm, steady presence offering quiet, genuine support during a moment that felt like both a culmination and a beginning all at once. In the months following the Foundation's successful gala, my relationship with Michael continued deepening steadily, built on the same foundation of honesty and mutual respect that had defined our working partnership from the very beginning. I introduced him properly to my parents during a quiet Sunday dinner, watching nervously as my father, always protective and careful about anyone entering our small family's life, studied Michael carefully throughout the evening. He seems like a genuinely good man, my father told me privately afterward, helping clear dishes from the table. Patient with the kids, respectful, clearly cares about meaningful work rather than just impressive titles or status. Your mother and I both like him very much. I like him very much too, I admitted, smiling softly at my father's careful, thoughtful assessment. Michael, for his part, never once seemed intimidated or overly impressed by the significant wealth Daniel had left behind, treating our foundation's mission and my everyday family life with the same genuine, grounded respect, regardless of the financial resources involved. This quality, more than almost anything else, helped me trust that his growing affection for me and my children came from something real and lasting, rather than from any complicated fascination with financial circumstances. About 2 years after we first met through the Foundation's board, Michael proposed to me during a quiet weekend camping trip, choosing a simple, heartfelt moment beside a campfire rather than any elaborate, showy gesture. "Sarah," he said, kneeling beside the fire with a small ring in his trembling hands. "I love you, and I love Lily and Ben, more than I ever imagined possible. I don't need grand gestures or fancy proposals. I just want to build a genuine, honest life alongside you and your children, for as long as we're fortunate enough to have together." Tears filled my eyes as I said yes, feeling a profound, grateful sense of peace settle over me, knowing that whatever new chapter lay ahead, it would be built on the same values of honesty and genuine partnership that had carried me through the most difficult and transformative period of my entire life. Lily and Ben, now approaching their teenage and preteen years respectively, greeted the news of our engagement with genuine, uncomplicated joy, having grown to love Michael's patient, steady presence in our lives over the previous 2 years. "Does this mean Michael is going to be our stepdad?" Ben asked, his tone carrying genuine excitement rather than any hesitation or concern. "If that's something you both want," I said carefully, always mindful of respecting my children's feelings about any changes affecting our small, tightly bonded family unit. "I want that," Lily said firmly, hugging me warmly. "Michael's really great, Mom. I think Dad would have liked him a lot too." Her thoughtful, generous acknowledgement of both Daniel's memory and Michael's genuine goodness struck me deeply, reflecting the same emotional wisdom and maturity that had grown steadily within both my children throughout our family's remarkable, unexpected journey over the previous several years. As our wedding planning began taking shape alongside the foundation's continued growth, I found myself reflecting often on the remarkable, winding path that had brought me to this particular moment in my life, a path that began, quite improbably, with a simple $17 cash discrepancy at an ordinary bank teller station. I thought often about the version of myself who had walked calmly into Grant Pierce's office that Tuesday afternoon, completely unaware that her carefully maintained, deliberately separated life was about to collide dramatically, publicly, and ultimately transformatively. I thought about the humiliation of that firing, the shock of standing in front of coworkers while being dismissed over something so minor and easily explainable. I thought about the quiet, determined resolve that had led me to Diane's office that same evening, and the surreal experience of walking into First Union's private banking division the following morning, finally allowing my two separate identities to fully intersect for the first time in 4 years. I thought about Grant's stunned, dawning shame upon learning the truth, about Patricia's genuine efforts toward meaningful institutional reform, about Marcus's unwavering friendship and eventual partnership in building something meaningful together. I thought about Mrs. Kowalski's tearful gratitude, about the hundreds of working families our foundation had ultimately helped navigate their own difficult, unfair workplace circumstances. Most of all, I thought about Daniel, about the quiet, careful values he had instilled in our family long before his sudden, devastating death, values that had ultimately guided every significant decision I made throughout this entire remarkable journey. I like to believe he would feel genuinely proud, watching how his hard-earned success had eventually grown into something meaningful, extending far beyond our own small family into the lives of countless working parents facing similarly unfair circumstances. "You've built something incredible," Diane told me one afternoon, as we reviewed the Foundation's latest impact report together, now approaching nearly 1,000 families helped since our very first case involving Mrs. Kowalski's cafeteria position. "I hope you recognize that, Sarah, not just the financial resources you brought to this work, but your genuine determination, your willingness to be vulnerable and honest about your own painful experience, your commitment to building something that actually makes a real, meaningful difference." "I couldn't have built any of it alone," I said honestly, genuinely grateful for the remarkable team of people who had gathered around this shared mission over the previous several years. Marcus, you, Michael, our entire staff and board, everyone brought something essential to this work. "That's true," Diane agreed, smiling warmly. "But it started with you, Sarah. Your decision to stand up for yourself, and ultimately for so many others, that's what set everything else into motion." Her words settled comfortably into my heart as I continued reflecting on everything our small, unlikely foundation had accomplished together. born from an act of casual, careless unfairness that Grant Pierce could never have anticipated would ultimately transform not just my own life, but the lives of so many working families throughout our entire community. I also thought, quite often, about the version of myself who might have existed if I had simply accepted Grant's decision quietly that Tuesday afternoon, gone home, cried in private, and moved on to some other ordinary teller job elsewhere without ever revealing the truth about my hidden fortune. That version of myself, I suspected, would have eventually healed from the humiliation in her own time, would have found new work, would have continued raising Lily and Ben with the same quiet love and careful values I had always prioritized. But she would never have discovered the particular strength and purpose that came from transforming her own painful experience into something that reached so far beyond her own small family. I felt no regret about the private, deliberately modest life I had built in those 4 years before everything changed. That careful choice had given my children a genuine, grounded childhood, free from the complicated dynamics that early exposure to significant wealth might otherwise have created. But I also felt genuinely grateful that circumstances had eventually pushed me toward a different, more open path, one that allowed both halves of my identity, careful working mother and quietly resourceful widow, to finally work together toward something larger than either one alone could have accomplished. Michael and I married on a warm autumn afternoon, choosing a small, intimate ceremony in the same park where he had first taught Ben how to properly throw a baseball, a location that carried genuine, meaningful significance for our blended family, rather than any showy or extravagant symbolism. Lily, now 12 years old, served as my maid of honor, her thoughtful, poised presence beside me throughout the ceremony, reflecting just how remarkably she had grown throughout the years since that difficult, transformative period following my firing from First Union Bank. Ben, now 10, proudly stood beside Michael as his best man, beaming with genuine excitement throughout the entire ceremony. Marcus and Diane both attended, along with Patricia Yang, Mrs. Kowalski, and dozens of other individuals whose lives had intersected with our remarkable journey over the previous several years. Even Grant Pierce attended, his presence no longer carrying any trace of awkwardness or tension, but rather genuine warmth and gratitude for the unexpected, meaningful partnership that had grown between us despite our difficult beginning. I never imagined, watching you walk out of my office that Tuesday afternoon, that I would eventually be standing here today, genuinely happy to celebrate this moment with you. Grant told me quietly during the reception, offering a warm, sincere hug. Thank you for the grace you've shown me throughout these past few years, Sarah. I don't know that I deserved it, but I'm deeply grateful nonetheless. We all deserve the chance to learn and grow from our mistakes, I said gently, genuinely meaning every word. I'm glad you found your own meaningful path forward too, Grant. During my wedding toast, Michael spoke warmly about the unexpected winding path that had brought us together, acknowledging Daniel's memory with genuine respect and gratitude, rather than any awkward avoidance. I never had the honor of meeting Daniel, Michael said, raising his glass toward our gathered friends and family. But I feel like I know him well, through Sarah's stories, through Lily and Ben's memories, and through the remarkable foundation built in his honor. I promise to always honor his memory and to continue building a life together that reflects the same values of hard work, integrity, and genuine care for others that clearly defined his entire life. Tears filled my eyes as I listened to Michael's heartfelt words, feeling profound gratitude for the remarkable, unexpected journey that had led me to this joyful, meaningful moment, surrounded by genuine friends and family who had each played their own significant role throughout this extraordinary chapter of my life. 3 years after that fateful Tuesday when Grant Pierce fired me over a $17 cash discrepancy, the Daniel Mitchell Foundation for Working Families had grown into one of the most respected workplace advocacy organizations throughout our entire state, having helped well over 2,000 working families navigate unfair employment disputes and having inspired meaningful policy reforms across dozens of regional financial institutions and other major employers. Marcus now served as the Foundation's executive director, having grown remarkably skilled at leading our expanding organization's daily operations, while I focused increasingly on strategic partnerships and broader advocacy work, testifying occasionally before state legislative committees, considering stronger workplace protection laws for hourly and low-wage workers. Michael and I had welcomed a new addition to our blended family, a daughter named Grace, whose bright, curious personality delighted her older siblings, Lily and Ben, now teenagers who had grown into genuinely thoughtful, compassionate young people, each already expressing interest in eventually continuing our family's meaningful advocacy work in their own future careers. Mrs. Kowalski, now retired from her cafeteria position, occasionally volunteered at our foundation's office, helping coordinate our growing network of community outreach programs, her genuine gratitude and warmth remaining a constant, meaningful presence throughout our organization's continued growth. Grant Pierce's management training organization had grown significantly as well, now partnering formally with our foundation to offer joint workshops helping companies throughout the region implement fairer, more transparent disciplinary and termination procedures, transforming his own painful professional downfall into genuinely meaningful educational work, benefiting countless other managers and employees alike. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, exactly 3 years after my dramatic firing, our now considerably larger family gathered together in our backyard, celebrating the Foundation's latest milestone, its 2000th successfully resolved case, a modest celebration compared to our earlier, more formal gala, but one that carried deep, genuine significance for everyone who had played a role throughout this remarkable journey. Diane arrived early, as she always did, helping arrange the small buffet table with the same careful, practical attention she brought to every aspect of our lives together. Patricia Yang stopped by briefly between other commitments, proudly updating me on First Union Bank's continued progress implementing fairer workplace policies across their entire branch network. Even Robert Klein, Grant's former district manager, sent along a thoughtful card acknowledging the Foundation's remarkable growth, a small but meaningful gesture, given how tense our very first interactions following Grant's termination had initially been. "Can you believe it's already been 3 years?" Michael asked, wrapping his arm gently around my shoulders as we watched our children playing together in the late afternoon sunlight. "Sometimes it feels like an entire lifetime ago," I said thoughtfully, "and sometimes it feels like just yesterday, sitting nervously in Grant's office, having no idea my whole life was about to change so dramatically." "I'm endlessly grateful it did," Michael said softly, kissing my temple gently. Watching my children together in that peaceful, sunny backyard, surrounded by the remarkable community of people whose lives had intersected through this extraordinary journey, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything that had grown from such a painful, humiliating beginning. Grant Pierce once fired me over $17, certain I was simply an ordinary, easily replaceable bank teller unworthy of basic fairness or respect. He had no idea, in that moment, that his careless, unjust decision would eventually unravel into consequences far beyond anything he could have possibly anticipated, and that the quiet, unassuming woman he dismissed so easily would go on to build something genuinely meaningful, transforming her own painful experience into lasting, positive change for thousands of working families just like her. Sometimes, I have learned, our most difficult, humiliating moments carry within them the unexpected seeds of profound transformation, if we allow ourselves the courage and determination to let something meaningful grow from even our deepest pain. Thank you for reading The Bank Manager Fired a Single Mom Over 7 Times. Minutes later, she withdrew $63 million. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real banks, companies, or individuals is purely coincidental. I hope Sarah's story reminded you that everyone deserves fair, dignified treatment, regardless of their circumstances, and that genuine kindness and integrity often carry rewards far greater than any single financial account ever could.